Hello and welcome into another episode of The Hard Fowl. I'm your host, Pearson Fowler, and with me, as always, to break down a lot of breaking news from the world of basketball, specifically college basketball. Did a little bit of NBA last time. We're going to keep it to college and mostly South Carolina here. As always, from GamecockCentral.com is Collyn Taylor. And Collyn, we're recording this on a Tuesday, not on a Thursday, because you're getting ready to move. Officially, you were getting things in order the last time we did a podcast, and now you're just a couple days away from moving. So how far behind are you in the moving process?
Believe it or not, I am ahead of schedule. So we are, because my fiance would absolutely murder me if she walked in to help me move, and I was behind in packing. Been there, done that, got the T-shirt. And
got the T-shirt. I was murdered by my fiance for dragging my feet.
Yes, and do not want to relive that again. Mm-hmm. So I started packing about a week and a half ago, getting a little together, and it's paid differently enough. Being proactive has helped me in my life.
That's incredible, and not that I'm sure you needed any other confirmation that you were making a good decision this fall, October, right, when you officially tie the knot. But to have someone that's going to help you be proactive in a move, like that's really invaluable, because there's nothing worse than two procrastinators being together and then all of a sudden you're behind the eight ball. Although, a wise man once told me, and this was my freshman year roommate, and this has stuck with me forever, because he and I were both procrastinators, and we were, I guess just say, really bad influences on each other when it came to, finishing papers and things like that, and especially once he told me his sort of catchphrase for life, which was, if you wait until the last minute, it only ever takes a minute. And I was like, oh no, this is the beginning of the end for me. But so
you're making a lot of sense there.
But point of that story, whether it's a fiance or a roommate or whoever it is, find someone that can help you be proactive if you are a procrastinator. But no, that's very exciting. Congratulations. The next time we'll talk, you'll be in a new home. And you said you're moving closer to downtown Columbia. Is that correct?
Yeah, moving down closer to downtown. Going to be living near, but not with my fiance until we obviously tie said knot in October.
Very good. Well, yeah, that'll be a lot easier for you to get to all the press conferences and things that I guess hopefully we will be going to sooner rather than later. Everything is still digital right now, Zoom meetings, phone calls, things like that. You and I are still sadly apart, not participating, but still continuing to social distance. I was going to say participating in social distancing like it's something we're all excited about and wanting to do, but we're still observing those social courtesies by keeping our distance from one another, and hopefully you and I will see each other in person soon enough. But in the meantime, this will have to suffice, and especially with as much news as we have had in the last couple weeks since we did a podcast, including the NBA, setting a new date for when you can withdraw your name from draft consideration, a new signee for South Carolina, and the hiring of a new assistant coach. We'll start with the new signee. His name is Jacoby Wright, and he's a guy that's got a lot of pedigree in terms of the guys that he has played for and been around, just a lot of basketball IQ, a lot of basketball acumen, experience in terms of his young playing days, and now he's hopefully going to bring some of that to South Carolina. But Collyn, walk me through the recruitment of Jacoby Wright and what kind of player South Carolina's getting.
Yeah, this has kind of been going on for about a year now. Jacoby obviously first came on campus, I want to say in October, for a football game to watch practice, kind of do the typical visit with the coaching staff, all that. Loved it. Decided to come back, came back a couple times during the season. South Carolina saw him a couple times during the season, scouted him, and then offered him in April, and it didn't take him long after that to commit, and then obviously publicly commit, Sunday on Father's Day. So it's been kind of building for a while. I give a lot of credit to Bruce Shingler for finding him, building that relationship with his family and him, and that was one of the biggest reasons why Jacoby obviously committed to South Carolina, was because of Bruce Shingler and because of the bond that he was able to build with the staff. And in terms of what they're getting, it's kind of a prototypical Frank point guard, facilitates the offense really well, is very efficient, isn't too flashy, can shoot the ball well, averaged 18 points or 17.4, I want to say it was, on a really, really good high school team last year with other really good players, and ran their offense well, played good defense, and is a guy that fit is so important to Frank. And when you talk about fit, he kind of really fits what they do, and he's good now and then can develop into someone that's even better as he gets into Carolina and obviously gets into the strength and conditioning program and continues his development.
Yeah, we always know that, or obviously know that Frank is always, kind of looking for a specific type of guy. And I mean, you look at the offer list from Jacoby Wright, and it's not necessarily Kansas and Duke and North Carolina, but as you mentioned, Frank knows what he wants, and you also factor in, I think no small part of it is, you mentioned the relationship, but being coached by a guy like B.J. Jackson, who's coached a couple other NBA guys throughout his career, and just kind of what you pick up being in that kind of environment, I think is important, especially, again, the way that Frank likes to coach, the way that Frank likes players to play. I think, I don't know if we've talked about it on this podcast or off the podcast or whatever, but it seems like maybe even more so in basketball than any other sport, baseball, football, whatever. It seems like recruiting for fit and recruiting, like in some ways even like based on like personality or style of play and things like that, is more of a factor than just go out and get this guy. Because like, I guess just for example, I think there's a very realistic chance, and you can speak a little bit more, you kind of touched on the skill set there already, but just what Jacoby will bring to how Frank specifically wants to play. This like as a 3-star guy with, offers from places like Charlotte, College of Charleston, DePaul, Elon, places like that, might end up being a better fit for South Carolina than somebody that's, more highly ranked and, has more offers from more high-profile schools, which is not to say that, you shouldn't try to get more talented guys, but I think that what Frank Martin has demonstrated, especially in the last couple of years, is based on what he wants to do. And maybe this is more South Carolina specific than basketball specific, but I just think fit is incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to look at offer lists, and with Jacoby, you look at his, and it doesn't necessarily blow you away. There's obviously a couple reasons for that. I think he was vastly under-recruited. But with South Carolina in particular, Frank could give 2 rips about how many stars you have or who's offered you or who's done this and who's done that. He doesn't get sucked into all that stuff, and that trickles down to his staff. And, I mean, with Jacoby, it's a guy that they don't put a lot of stock into, well, he's like a top 50 player. He's, one of the best point guards, this or that in the country. They look at a guy and says he does the things well that we want him to do. He can do them better. We can develop him. And they trust their instincts. They trust their development skills. And their track record kind of speaks for themselves for the guys that stay in the program. They tend to have pretty good years when they're juniors and seniors. So with Jacoby, I mean, he kind of fits what they want to do. He fits well. He's an in-state kid, which I don't think is has been talked about nearly enough. But in-state kid who I think if coronavirus didn't cancel the live periods this summer, would easily have seen more Power 5, high major schools, whatever you want to call them, hop into the mix.
So let's spend a little bit more time on that. This is not a detour that I was necessarily expecting to take, but it's one that's interesting because this is another area that I think basketball recruiting greatly differs, specifically from football recruiting, where it is so important to win your state and you have such an advantage with those guys. Where you're from, by and large, doesn't really seem to matter. I mean, you look at the composition of South Carolina's rosters last year. I mean, you have guys from Canada, you have guys from Estonia, you have guys from all over the country. It doesn't really matter that I guess locality of recruiting doesn't seem to be as significant a factor, either for the players or for teams. And yet, and I mean, this is obviously for a separate reason, but when people talk about Zion Williamson, when people talk about John Morant, people around here get so upset because it's like, man, how could you let these in-state kids get away? And like with Zion, it's like, okay, you know what? You were probably never really, really going to get Zion because he always wanted to go to Duke, and he's like the most incredible college basketball player that I've ever seen in my life. For people that are older than me, that's probably true too. Basically, I mean, I don't know how far back you have to go to find a player that was as dominant and as exciting and well-liked as Zion. So the point is, that was always going to be a long shot. I don't care if he's from Spartanburg. I don't care, I don't care if he grew up the son of 2 professors at the University of South Carolina. That was always going to be a long shot to get a guy like that to come to Columbia. But people put such an emphasis on that. They make it seem like it was so uniquely devastating to not get Zion, to not get Ja, which, again, is a slightly different story as a guy that I think really burst onto the scene in college and then has had, of course, an incredible rookie year in the NBA. But, how much stock should we put in that, given that it doesn't seem to be as integral in the fabric of recruiting in basketball as it does in football. But Jacoby Wright is an in-state kid, and you're right. People aren't talking about that. Should we be talking about that more, or is it kind of a non-factor like I felt like it was with Ja and with Zion?
Yeah, college recruiting is so weird in that regard because you want to win your state, and South Carolina's been better about over the last two classes than they had in previous classes. But you want to win your state, but in the grand scheme, sometimes it doesn't matter. I mean, a lot of these kids go to prep school anyway, so they're away from home to begin with. So I don't think the in-state card is necessarily as big of a deal as it is for maybe football, especially football, and to a degree baseball. But, I mean, if you have good players in your state, you want to be able to pull them in, you know? If you have, and so South Carolina's had a handful of really good players come through the state, and you look at their roster and they're able to kind of land them. I know Seventh Woods took a while to come back to South Carolina. And honestly, and this is a detour I didn't know we'd be taking either, but at South Carolina, you're in such a weird spot because sometimes, especially for basketball, you had kids that grew up watching North Carolina and Duke, and in South Carolina, in Columbia, Charleston, Greenville, wherever, you had them growing up to be Duke or North Carolina fans because those were the biggest brands of basketball when they were growing up. And, I mean, they're still two of the biggest brands of basketball. So South Carolina's in a really weird spot with that because even if they're an in-state kid, their dream school might not be South Carolina or Clemson or any of the other in-state schools that would be in North Carolina or at Duke. And if they're good enough to go there and get an offer from there, I mean, you're fighting an uphill battle at that point. So I'm going to give a lot Frank and Chuck and Bruce and now obviously Will Bailey, Perry Clark before that. You look at the roster they have now with Trey Hannibal and Seventh Woods and Jalen McCreary, who played 1 year in South Carolina at Legacy, where Jacoby obviously plays now, and Mike Green and their two incoming signees with Patrick Uriel and Javon Benson, and now Jacoby Wright for the 2021 class. They're doing a really good job of getting some of the higher profile guys in this 2021 group. And, you know, they're still recruiting a few in state, and they got even more to come in the 2022 group that they're recruiting as well.
Well, and you mentioned Carolina doing a better job of that in the last couple of years. 3 guys on the roster right now from the state of South Carolina, or at least with hometowns that say, you know, South Carolina on the roster. That's obviously Trey Hannibal, Seventh Woods, whom you mentioned, and then Mike Green being the other guy for Myrtle Beach. But you look at it, I mean, like last year, it's basically just Trey Hannibal because Mike Green was not a regular rotation guy, and Seventh Woods was still finishing out his career, or I guess he was sitting out. He had just finished his career in North Carolina, transferred in, was sitting out last year, so on the roster, but not actually playing. So it's a very, very small percentage, and I think that's, you know, that does bother some people that, you know, really, and I mean, like you said, it is important to win your state, and I think a lot of people put emphasis on that, and people are kind of used to thinking about it in like football terms, but it's not like South Carolina is worse because they don't have like 6 guys from the state of South Carolina. Part of it's also like, you know, how good is whatever state you're in basketball? And I don't follow basketball recruiting enough to know where South Carolina is. Is it one of the better ones? Is it one of the worst? Is it sort of middle of the pack in terms of the talent that they produce on a regular basis? And then the other part of it, like you mentioned, is just like how many guys actually go from high school straight into college, and how many guys will take a prep school route, or, you know, I mean, I guess JUCO, we don't see as much of that, especially compared to, like, you know, baseball, but it is a little bit more complicated. And I guess buried in all that is a question that I'm putting you on the spot because I didn't tell you that I was going to ask you this, but where is South Carolina, like, nationally? If you had to put a range of like plus or minus 7, where would you say South Carolina is in terms of the high school basketball talent that it produces?
I mean, it's not, you know, New York. It's not in, you know, Illinois or Indiana or anything like that, but it's probably a top, you know, 25 in the upper half, I would say, of high school basketball in the country, just seeing it and being there in person. And I'm probably a little biased because, you know, I see a little bit more than I see Florida or Georgia or wherever. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I would say that it's probably up there. Just top half, top 20, top 25, top 30 maybe. And you look at there's been a lot of good talent that's come out of here, even if it didn't go to South Carolina. Whether that's Zion and Ja, but Bryce McGowan is really good for 2021, and he's going to Florida State. And Trey Jackson went to Iowa State last year and had a really good freshman season. So there's talent to mine. Now, obviously, you have to go out and get it and recruit it well. But if you don't, I'm a big proponent of it does not matter where the good players come from as long as they're good players.
Mm-hmm.
They're on a full scholarship regardless. I mean, it's not like baseball where you have partial scholarships. These guys, regardless if they're from Timbuktu or Columbia, still get their scholarship paid in full. So, some of the best players on South Carolina's team right now. I mean, Trey Hannibal's a South Carolina kid, but AJ Lawson isn't. Keyshawn Bryan isn't. Justin Minaya, Will Levesque, Jalen McCrew is from Georgia, played in South Carolina 1 year. I mean, these guys are still good.
Mm-hmm.
Just because the driver's licenses don't say South Carolina on it doesn't good. But if you got a guy in your backyard, I mean, I know the staff wants to recruit South Carolina. That's their primary focus. But if things don't work out there, then they've shown the ability to go elsewhere outside of the state and pull in pretty good talent as well.
Speaking of driver's licenses, did Mike Kotsar and does AJ Lawson have a driver's license?
That's a very good question. I honest to God have never asked. It's a very good question. I've asked Mike about his shoe size, about riding on airplanes, about everything else in the world, but I've never asked him if he had a driver's license.
That's. I mean, he probably didn't need one. I mean, everything's right here on campus. I say here. I'm basically on campus. I walk 5 minutes and get to campus, but I'd be curious. Do you know what Mike is up to at this moment? Obviously, workouts and things for prospects after basketball have kind of been halted, or at least you're kind of resigned to your own quarters, wherever those may be. But I know you talked to Mike a little bit before the shutdown, like just after the season, or right during the shutdown, because it was right after everybody got back from Nashville, so as things were shutting down. But what would you, if you don't know specifically, what would you guess Mike's doing right now at the end of June?
I think he's still rehabbing his shoulder a little bit. That's kind of a longer process, and he signed with an agent. Good for Mike, and we'll see. I think he's trying to line up something maybe in a Euro League or something like that to get home a little bit closer to family.
Very good. Very good. All right, well, we'll get another Mike Kotsar update once the Euro League starts, because I'm sure he'll be tearing it up over there, because he's got the perfect skill set for the European game. The big that can do more of the skillful things as opposed to just banging with your back to the basket and things like that. But nice little random Mike Kotsar detour there. I want to get back one more question about the roster composition for South Carolina as we talk. Again, this is all sort of a spinoff of Jacoby Wright, who is a local kid from Greenville, another South Carolina kid. So bringing the total of I guess by the 2021 roster, Seventh Woods will have cycled out, so you'll still have 3 on the team. But if I told you that Carolina could have the exact same talent level on its roster, but have 7 kids from South Carolina instead of 3, would you say that is better? Doesn't make a difference, like truly does not matter, or worse?
I don't think it really matters. I know a lot of people listening, because South Carolinians, and of which I am one, have a lot of pride in their state, but I know a lot of them would probably want to have 13 guys in the same talent level from South Carolina. It just doesn't work like that. And I really don't think it matters. Good players, like I said, I mean, it doesn't matter what your driver's license says. If you can ball, you can ball. So it's just, you want to recruit and you want to keep relationships in the state, just like what Muschamp said. I mean, you want to win the state, but if you can't or you don't, then there's plenty of other talent elsewhere. In basketball, it's not necessarily geographically centered as it is in maybe football or baseball.
Right. Well, let's say Jacoby Wright, again, local kid, 3-star point guard, combo guard. You kind of touched on his skill set there, and obviously, Frank Martin's going to use him more in that point guard role. So come in 2021 and learn from Jermaine Couisnard for a year, and then Jermaine will go to the NBA, and then Jacoby Wright will take over, and Carolina will be amidst a run of 5 straight tournaments. I don't know. That's how I'm playing it out. That's what the point of recruiting is, right? Just to get optimistic about what what the future could be. But there you go. Jacoby Wright, the latest commit for the class of 2021 for South Carolina. The other big piece of breaking news from the last couple weeks, since the last time we did this podcast, is South Carolina has hired a new assistant coach. We talked about what exactly Frank Martin was going to be looking for throughout that process, and he had some surgery, ankle surgery, right? Or knee surgery? Ankle?
Yeah, full knee replacement.
Oh, knee replacement. Okay. All right. And he's, I guess, doing all right if he's already gone out and hired a new assistant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got to talk to him last week, and he was in weirdly good spirits. So the first couple of days were rough, but he's powered through, and he's actually in a pretty good spot.
He powered through, he made some phone calls, and he went and hired Will Bailey, who has spent the last couple years at St. Louis. What do you know about their pre-existing relationship, how Frank Martin found Will Bailey, landed on Will Bailey, and how Will Bailey ended up here in Columbia?
Yeah, so, I mean, they've had some kind of – they never coached on the same staff together but have some connections. Weirdly enough, Will Bailey – was at UAB as a player when Andy Kennedy was an assistant there, and then Andy Kennedy obviously takes a job in Cincinnati with Frank and Bob Huggins. So they have a mutual connection there. They both coached in the A-10 together at different times, and so they have a connection there. And Frank's always kind of kept up with him, and he was on the short list, and things just kind of progressed from there, and it's a good fit for South Carolina, and it's a chance for Bailey to jump up and go from assistant at St. Louis in the A-10 to now, obviously, jumping into the SEC and able to recruit at a little bit higher level.
So what do you know about Bailey in terms of his skill set? Obviously, we mentioned last podcast that to be a basketball assistant, you kind of have to be able to do everything. It's a lot of scouting. It's obviously everything you're doing in practice. It's a lot of recruiting and developing those relationships. But is he someone that's more known for his recruiting, someone that's more known for his schematic prowess, or someone that's just kind of a generally well-rounded guy?
I mean, he's pretty well-rounded. If I'm putting, one or two things ahead of the others, I would probably say he's better at development / scouting together. And then, he's still a good recruiter. I'm not saying he's not, but he's elite at the other two. And good recruiter. Anytime you come from a mid-major like St. Louis and you've won 23 games, I want to say back-to-back seasons, or 20-plus games back-to-back seasons, you know how to develop and you know how to coach. Even if you're an assistant, you know how to develop and you know how to coach. So it's a great fit because, he works with the guards. So they'll be able to, if AJ comes back, work with him and Jermaine and then Trey Hannibal and all these guys that they're able to develop and take another step forward too. And from a recruiting standpoint, he's a good recruiter. It's a lot easier, I would imagine, to recruit to the SEC to South Carolina than it would be to recruit to St. Louis or Chicago State or East Tennessee State, where he's been in the past. So that'll help him on the recruiting trail. He's a good recruiter. Gives South Carolina some ties to a couple basketball hotbeds, with being the St. Louis area, Kansas City. He was in Chicago, is from Chicago, so he gives them some Chicago ties, and has recruited South Carolina's kind of what Frank called pocket as well. So that certainly helps with recruiting and gives them a few areas, and they're slowly building to where they have coaches that can recruit specific areas and recruit them well, whether that's, Frank in the Northeast or South Florida, Bruce Shingler in the Carolinas and D.C., Chuck Martin in somewhat of the Midwest and the Northeast, obviously, and then obviously now Will Bailey with Chicago and then St. Louis and some of the Eastern Seaboard. So pretty well-rounded, and I think it's a really, really good fit for what South Carolina's trying to do.
I'm glad you took it to the recruiting angle. That's where I wanted to go as well, because you hire someone that, again, it's different in basketball than in football. And my instinct, just because I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, is to kind of think about everything as football first, and the way that football does things is sort of being the norm in basketball. It's I won't say the opposite, but it's just very, very different in a lot of ways. Now, and if South Carolina, if the football team were to hire somebody from a program of similar pedigree to St. Louis relative to South Carolina, I think a lot of people would be like, well, what are you doing? You can't you can't come and recruit in the SEC and do all these things, whether or not that's right or wrong. And obviously, all coaches, well, most coaches start out at smaller places anyway. So there has to be a progression there, and there has to be some room for that growth. But just in general, like if South Carolina, instead of hiring Mike Bobo, had hired, as Wes Mitchell and I wanted Carolina to do, like some guy from D3 football that was just like really avant-garde with his like play calling and play design and was just like super progressive and basically just called football plays like an NCAA video game. I think that would have made Wes and me happy, and then probably nobody else. I don't know. That probably would have made you happy too. That seems like something you would like. But
oh yeah, my nerd brain would love it.
Yeah, but point is, I think maybe people that think about football or people that are within the game of football, there seems to be more conservatism with specifically hires in the way that they think about the development and the progression of the game. This seems like something that basketball people would allow themselves to be a little bit more excited about because of what you mentioned. The football part of me says, okay, this is a guy that's been at, like I said, St. Louis, LaSalle, East Tennessee State, Maine, Chicago State. He doesn't know what it takes to recruit in the SEC, but the other part of that is, hey, if he was able to recruit at those places, he's certainly going to be able to recruit now that he's at a bigger program with better facilities, and like a little bit of momentum. Obviously, last year was kind of weird, and we don't know exactly how it ended, but I think there's reason to be optimistic about the immediate future of the basketball program just because of the talent that you're bringing in and some of the flashes that you've seen. And I mean, you think about a couple of Gamecocks that are going to be, Sendarius Thornwell, obviously SEC Player of the Year, and then in the years since then, you have two guys that are going to be participating in the Orlando restart because they're on good NBA teams, and Brian Bowen playing for the Pacers just a little bit here and there, and then PJ Dozier, who's become a solid rotation player for the Denver Nuggets, one of the best teams in the Western Conference. So you see all that, and you really kind of project some forward momentum. So all that to say, you bring in somebody who's proven that he can recruit at those other places, and you give him better facilities and a bigger, more name brand program, and I think that's something that you can get excited about and expect to project relatively well. And you already touched on this too, but I really wanted to touch on this because as much as we've talked about recruiting not being so localized in the game of basketball, having those ties to somewhere, like Chicago, like holy cow, Chicago. If you have ties and relationships in Chicago, that is a big, big, big deal. Same with, not that Maine, I don't know if Maine's like a huge basketball state, but when you have a little bit more access to the Northeast, I think all these things are just good. It's basically giving yourself more pipelines is how I think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is that Frank likes to recruit. You obviously want to recruit your state first and recruit guys in your state first, but Frank loves to pull players from the Northeast because he's coached up there. They love to pull players from South Florida, and in basketball, like in football, when you have a staff hiring, you look at ties to your geographical area. So when Will Muschamp needed an offensive coordinator, he went and pulled Mike Bobo, who obviously has ties to the geographical area. Same with Tracy Rocker. Same with Joe Cox. So you recruit to the geographical area. In basketball, there's no real geographical area. You recruit pretty much, the entire country if you have good enough players. So to get a guy that has ties to two of the bigger hotbeds of basketball talent in that St. Louis, Kansas City area, and then Chicago, to pair with his ties to the Northeast where Frank and Chuck Martin already have ties, and Bruce English ties in the D.C. area, that's huge. So I think recruiting is going to be a good fit. I'm excited to see what he's going to be able to do with kind of the resources he has now in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, he's replacing Perry Clark. We talked a lot about Perry Clark a couple weeks ago during our last podcast, and he was someone that was, in a lot of ways, the mastermind behind a lot of the schemes that South Carolina runs. Now, obviously, this all comes from Frank Martin, but by all indications, he was the scheme guy. Now, you mentioned Coach Bailey, a pretty varied skill set, good developer, good recruiter, good at developing the relationships on the recruiting trail. But is that torch that Perry Clark had of sort of being the scheme guy going to be passed to, either like one of the other assistants? Is it going to be passed to Shingler? Is it going to be passed to Martin? I don't imagine that Bailey would come in and necessarily be that guy right away, especially if it's not kind of foremost in his skill set. Or is that something that all the assistants are now going to have to band together to try to replace what Perry Clark did schematically?
I mean, I think Bailey's a phenomenal scouting report guy, and I think he's really good at figuring out tendencies, and I think he's really, really good at that. But I also think Chuck Martin and Bruce Shingler are really good at that too, and I think Bruce has made a really big jump over the last couple of years to being able to help Frank and install some scouting reports. And I think it's going to be kind of all three, but, I mean, Bailey's no slouch in that regard either. I mean, he's a really, really good scouting report guy, and he's going to fit in well with what Chuck and Bruce both like to do too.
Obviously, we're still in the middle of a shutdown, so everything's still a little bit up in the air. And I don't remember, you mentioned this date last time, and I just am dumb and forget these things. So I don't know when exactly they can resume formal basketball activities. I know it's sooner rather than later, but what do you know of the contact that's been had? Have they been able to have Zoom meetings? Is he going to be able to introduce himself to the team already? Is it just kind of phone calls, texts, whatever, or is there going to be some way in like the near future that they'll be able to formally introduce him to the team?
Yeah, so I don't think he's going to start until July 1, the fiscal year begins, just as kind of a budgetary thing. But I'm sure they'll introduce him then, talk to the players, introduce him to some of the guys they have signed, committed, and he'll get to recruiting right after that. I know they're expected back on campus mid-July to begin all their testing. They kind of pushed the date back a little bit on that. But mid-July is kind of the date, kind of the time frame. They'll begin on-court stuff. I want to see the NCAA approve that July 20th, and then they'll go up until school starts with that too, just because obviously they don't want to have players have to go back home and then come back getting virus again or transmitting the virus to somebody else.
Right. Now, in some ways, that should be a lot easier to manage because you're only talking about 15 guys plus assistants and coaches and training staff and things like that. So hopefully it'll be a little bit easier to manage that than it has been with football, which by all indications, there have been football programs around the country, Texas and Clemson and a couple other places that have reported positive COVID-19 tests. I would imagine that most college football programs that have returned to campus have at least a positive COVID-19 test. We haven't heard that from South Carolina, and I guess you just have to assume that no news is good news there, and that even if there have been, that all the protocols in terms of quarantine and isolating have been followed and been sort of put into good practice. But it's nice from the basketball perspective that you're going to have the football team kind of going in and serving to kind of give you a trial run. And okay, well, when you bring guys back, this is what we did, and this is what worked, and this is what didn't. So hopefully it'll be a little bit easier. And again, I think even easier just because you're talking about a smaller group of people. And I imagine a lot of the protocols for the basketball team coming back are going to be similar to those protocols that the football team has been required to follow for the last couple weeks?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And they're going to sanitize everything, and they'll get all their tests done before they can even step foot on a court, and they'll be podded and quarantined together, however you want to talk about it. And yeah, I mean, it'll be a lot of it'll be very, very similar to how football looks, and football is going to be a very big guinea pig to what both basketball teams are going to be doing.
Yeah, good. That's the word that I was looking for. Guinea pig. Thank you for that. Yeah, so that'll start hopefully middle of July, and that's a little less than a month away that we'll actually have basketball players reporting to campus. And I guess right now it's going to be everybody. It's going to be Seventh Woods. It's going to be AJ Lawson. It's going to be everybody that we're expecting. But in terms of other news since we last potted, the NBA has officially resettled on the date of the NBA draft, and with that, the early withdrawal date has also been set for October 6th. Now, this was maybe not specifically, but this is about what we anticipated, and we sort of played out a scenario for what happens if it is a little bit closer to the start of the college basketball season than would maybe be comfortable. But again, at this point, if it's October 6th, there's no reason that AJ Lawson can't come back. Frank Martin sounds like he's completely expecting him to come back in the middle of July and work out and go through preseason camp and prepare as if he were going to be coming back to the University of South Carolina for the 2020-2021 season. But now that the date is set, does this provide any clearer picture for what we think will happen with AJ Lawson?
I mean, it's going to be interesting. I mean, there's a very real scenario that Lawson decides to keep his name in the draft, at least through arriving on campus and be working out with the team while still having his name in the pool. So that'll be an interesting dynamic. Do I still anticipate AJ Lawson back on campus and in a Gamecock uniform next year? Yes. But you just never know, and it's going to be interesting to see when he ultimately makes his decision because he has been meeting with teams. And, I mean, he's in talks. And at this point, a lot of these guys understand and know where they kind of fall on draft boards. So it'll be interesting to see how long it takes guys to really officially make their decisions on when to come back, and then AJ Lawson included.
This is really kind of getting to minutia and hypothetical specifics, but if AJ Lawson does stay in the NBA draft and does end up getting drafted, I imagine it wouldn't be until the middle or late second round, just based on his production. I think someone that would want to take a chance on him is someone that's not going to need him to come in and contribute right away, and that's going to be a team that's drafting at the back end of the draft because they're probably pretty good. And the thing that I think becomes interesting about this, as much as we said, yeah, it's going to be unusual for a lot of these guys because you're not going to have the opportunity to go to a lot of these facilities and work out in person for these teams and develop those relationships and have the interviews and do some of the things that will maybe help you stand out against what was, frankly, an underwhelming sophomore year. Sophomore year? Yeah, it was a sophomore year for AJ. I don't know why I forgot that for a second. Underwhelming sophomore year for AJ Lawson. That's how you sort of hedge against that. But now, since we have the NBA coming back, the teams are going to be headed to Orlando in about 2 weeks. I think it's that first or maybe second week of July 7th. So I don't know whether that's the first or second week of July. I think that's the date that they're going to start heading back to Orlando. So the teams aren't going to be there. They're not going to be in their facilities. They're going to be down in Orlando, and then you're certainly not going to have the opportunity. And by the time you have to make that decision, that the playoffs will just be ending. I think the potential last date of the NBA Finals would be like October 13th or 14th, maybe something like that. It won't be any. Well, it can't be any later than that. So I guess maybe there will be opportunities for teams that have gone home, but it's just a couple days. So basically, when we were playing it out, it's like, hey, you can't have workouts, but maybe if you can later in the year before the draft, if the season just gets canceled, if they can't finish, but things start to open back up again, like you can go have those workouts. It still seems like even though basketball is going to be played, even though the NBA season is going to have an ending to it, there's not really going to be any more opportunity for him to go and work out for those teams in person. So I can't imagine that his draft prospects are overly going to change between now and October 6th.
Yeah, and it's just a matter of, and Frank said it best, and I agree with him. If an NBA team wants to keep having meetings with you, wants to keep talking to you and having conversations, why not at least keep the option open and still take these meetings with these guys and talk to them and figure out what you need to do to be better for, if you decide to keep in the draft or if, you come back. So it makes sense for him to stay in the draft. It's not like he's having to travel every weekend or every other day to different places. He can still take these Zoom meetings and still talk to these guys and kind of figure out his next steps. And